Hey, my name's Kincy Clark. I was the director of support at Bolt for about 2 years. I recently left Bolt to start my own thing, but I have a depth of support experience. I've been running support and technical customer facing teams, let's say for about 15 plus years, primarily in the startup world. I'll be giving a talk. It's called the Five Finance Love Languages. Its subtitle is How to Talk to the CFO. So it's really about techniques that I've learned about how to communicate with the finance team to make sure that they understand support priorities, organization, and to help ensure that your priorities are understood by that team. Finance teams deal with literally every group in the company. And let's be honest, in a company that has a support team is probably driving revenue, and sales, marketing are going to be the finance team's priorities. And those teams typically don't have to expect finance teams to understand them. However, the rest of the teams that form a company that are just as important as sales often are not well understood. And I think it's a fallacy to expect a finance team to understand how everyone else operates. You can hope that they will, and maybe they should, but the fact is most of them don't. I take the approach of, hey, I'm going to responsibility and ownership for the conversation, and I'm going to learn how to speak their language so that there can be no confusion or misunderstanding around my priorities. And the language they speak is the language of business, which really everyone should be comfortable with speaking. I've also found that support leaders in general, I would say customer facing leaders, maybe in general, support leaders specifically, are not as tuned in on the business side of things and tend to focus on other priorities that don't align well with business goals. And if you work for a company, the company's in business, and it's really important to understand that language and how those priorities are established. I've experienced this many times that they will have a really inaccurate understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. They have a really inaccurate understanding of the value you're driving, and they won't really have an effective way of measuring your performance or your outcomes. So a common theme that I've seen is finance teams and other teams really focus on tickets. And so they want to talk about tickets because that's what they hear about. They hear about tickets from support. And I think we can all agree the volume and number and shape and size of tickets, while it's important for a team to understand, it doesn't define your value to the organization. We don't have support teams to do tickets. We have support teams to support customers and make our customers successful. That's why we have to translate that. And it's not immediately obvious to a finance person what that relationship between, for example, tickets or medium time to resolution or some of the other statistics that they read about and they hear about, those are operational metrics. So it's real important that we give them a clear understanding of the value support drives. It may seem obvious to a support leader, but obvious things are often not as obvious as they should be. I've been in a lot of organizations where the management leadership team is focused on, we got to reduce the number of tickets because that's going to reduce costs. It's not really. Reducing the number of tickets may have an impact on cost, but it probably is not the relationship we're looking for. And also, we're talking about the wrong thing. Should we be talking about costs or should we be talking about an investment? Support teams are investment and they should be doing things. We don't have support teams to save money. And oftentimes, if you position yourself as a cost center, and I've heard support leaders describe themselves as cost centers. If you describe yourself as a cost center, guess what? You're going to set yourself up for a scenario where you're going to be looked at as a way to save money. So if you want to change that narrative and you want people to see you as a value driver and a value creator, then you have to speak a different language than that of an expense center. It's one thing to say, hey, you need a support team. We keep customers. Without support, you wouldn't have any customers. All of that may be true, but if you can't really demonstrate that in a way that is palpable and can be put on some sort of measurement, you're really just saying words out loud, and it's going to fall on deaf ears more often than not. The CFO's role is to manage resources. That's his only job, the resources. And that is the language you have to speak. It's great that you have all these intangible outcomes, but the fuel, the engine, the coal is all money. And that's the resource that they control. So you have to be able to communicate with them in a way that they can translate that to a financial outcome, not necessarily a financial revenue or more money for the company or profitability, but you got to pay your team. And your team doesn't work for free. So that's money. If you want to pay your team good salaries, you really need to be able to demonstrate that they create great value. I have an accounting background from college, and I studied cost accounting, which is a very specific form of accounting where you're trying to understand costs. I was looking at that time at overhead centers, things like finance teams, ironically, are considered overhead. Human resources, those types of teams are all considered overhead. So I was looking at how to allocate those costs. I brought a lot of accounting knowledge with me. And just over the time, as I grew my career and got into more senior leadership roles, I'd say it culminated at Bolt, where I had an opportunity to work with a really good finance team that was also willing to listen and work with me. At that point in my career, I got all these ideas that I wanted to put together. And that was one of the amazing opportunities at Bolt, was we had the resources where I could do some things. And this is one of the things that I really had been wanting to do for some time. So this latent interest in accounting, a good understanding of accounting, because I could go talk to them in an accounting language and I could have some adult conversations with them that they weren't expecting to have with a support leader. They weren't expecting me to talk about expense categorizations and all the other things that kind of go into that. And so the outcome was just some really good mind shifts on that team. And I recognized, yeah, I wish someone had shared this with me a lot earlier in my career. I definitely could have benefited, because I definitely crossed swords with more than a few accounting and finance teams in the past where I was getting hacked. They wanted to cut stuff, and I couldn't articulate what the impact was because I was getting frustrated and I was being defensive. My experience at Bolt really sealed the deal on, yeah, I need to do it this way. This is a much more productive way to do it than fighting and complaining. The big shift, there were actually several things that happened. The first was an acceptance of my resourcing model. So they model, and I'll talk about this in more detail, they model teams' growth. And again, if you let the finance team model your growth, they're going to model it their way. They're not going to model it the way that makes sense necessarily. So I got them to accept a staffing and resourcing model. And that means, what are they budgeting? So a lot of support leaders are going to think like staffing in terms of who works when, where. No, we're talking about how much money are you getting next year to hire and retain people. That's the model we're talking about. So they got them to accept the model. But the big thing I got them to accept was the value proposition of support. I got them to stop thinking about us as a cost center that does tickets and just focusing on, Kincy, reduce tickets, reduce the number of tickets. Tickets are important signal. Maybe you don't want to reduce the number of tickets because maybe the tickets are telling you important information about your product and your customers. I got them to really shift their mindset and really understand the value of the team for where Bolt was at that time is more around understanding the product and the customer environment. That's the value we're bringing. We're not reducing operational costs as value. I am telling you really important things about the product. And I got the finance team to really understand that in a way that I would argue other teams maybe did not understand fully and appreciate the value. And that really created some great conversations internally about how we are positioning ourselves in the market. At the end of the day, those are the conversations we want to have. Is like, how are we driving a business? Not how can I get support more money? How can we be successful as an organization? That's the conversation you want to have. And how do you contribute to that? I think as a manager, this is less important. You need to be aware of it, because when you do get that call to be a director or a VP or head of support in another organization, this stuff's going to come pretty quick. And if you're not prepared to have those conversations, you can quickly get on the wrong end of things. It's just something to be aware of. And then as your career grows, as you start to move into more senior leadership roles, this becomes much more important. I think the earlier you start on this, the better. If you as a leader can communicate this, your stock goes up. One thing I'll share, we're picking on support. It's support driven, but we're not the only group that struggles with this. Success struggles with this. Professional services sometimes struggles with this, kind of depending on what phase of the business they're in. Engineering, strangely enough, in the tech world can often struggle with this because, again, their value propositions aren't necessarily crystal clear. Product teams. So a lot of teams struggle with this language, but I'm offering kind of some tools that are very support specific for support leaders. That's my background, that's my experience. But really, I've got some feedback about this that a lot of people should be looking at this video, not just support people.